In the year 2024, a plumber named Dave was breaking through a wall in an ordinary house when his hammer hit something soft. Tucked away in the darkness was a letter, sealed for 80 years. He opened it to discover it was a love letter from a soldier, written in 1944, a message that had never reached its destination. The house on Elm Street was a relic of a bygone era, a two-story structure that had seen generations come and go, its wooden floors groaning under the weight of countless stories. The air inside was thick with the scent of old wood, dust, and the faint, sweet smell of neglect. Its current owners, the Hendersons, had decided on a full renovation, wanting to breathe new life into its tired bones. They hired Dave for the plumbing, a job he'd done 1,000 times. But this house was different. It seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for a long-kept secret to finally be revealed to the world. Dave was a man of routine. He liked the simple certainty of his job. Find the leak, fix the pipe, go home. He wasn't a historian or a treasure hunter. He was just a plumber with a mortgage and 2 kids. As his sledgehammer opened up a section of wall in the downstairs hallway, he expected to find nothing more than old insulation and maybe a mouse nest. But as the plaster and lath crumbled, a small, off-white rectangle fluttered down with the debris, landing softly in a cloud of 80-year-old dust. It was an envelope, fragile and yellowed with age, bearing a faded postage stamp. For a moment, Dave just stared at it. His curiosity battled with the urge to simply sweep it up with the rest of the rubbish. He knelt down, his calloused fingers gently brushing away the dust. The paper was so brittle he feared it might disintegrate at his touch. He could just make out the elegant, looping handwriting on the front, addressed to a Miss Eleanor Wright. Right here at this very address, a sense of reverence washed over him. This wasn't just old paper, it was a piece of someone's life, a message frozen in time. He knew instinctively that throwing it away was not an option. He carefully pried open the delicate seal, his heart pounding a little faster than usual. Inside, the folded paper was in surprisingly good condition. The ink, a dark blue, had faded but was still perfectly legible. The letter began, "My dearest Eleanor," and Dave felt like an intruder, a voyeur peering into a moment of profound intimacy. The words that followed were not just a greeting. They were a lifeline, a desperate reach across an ocean of war and uncertainty. From a young man who was clinging to the memory of love as his only shield against the horrors around him, the first few lines painted a vivid picture of a young soldier's longing. He wrote about the mundane details of his life at the front, not to complain, but to make his world real for her. He spoke of the endless rain, the camaraderie with the other men in his platoon, and the gnawing loneliness that crept in during the quiet hours of the night. He confessed that the only thing that kept his spirit from breaking was her face, which he could conjure in his mind as clearly as if she were standing right in front of him. He was writing not just to her but for himself, to remind himself of what he was fighting for. He then dedicated an entire page to a single, cherished memory. He described a warm summer evening before he left, when they had danced to a Glenn Miller song on the radio in her parents' living room. He remembered the exact scent of the flowers in her hair and the way she laughed when he stepped on her toes. For a moment, reading those words, Dave was no longer in a dusty, demolished hallway in 2024. He was there, in that living room, a witness to a perfect, fleeting moment of happiness, a small pocket of peace in a world that was being torn apart by war. The letter's tone then shifted, becoming more earnest, more desperate. William made a solemn promise to her. He swore he would come back. He told her not to listen to bad news, to hold on to hope as tightly as he was. He laid out their future in beautiful, heartbreaking detail. The small house with a white picket fence they would build together, the children they would have, the quiet life they would lead. It was a dream of normalcy, a fantasy that millions of young men clung to in the trenches. It was a promise that, unbeknownst to him, was already in jeopardy. He ended the letter with a flourish of devotion, his words a final, heartfelt plea across the miles. "Whatever happens, know that my last thought will be of you. With all my love for all my days, your William." Below, the signature was the date, June 5, 1944, the day before the D-Day landings in Normandy. This wasn't just any letter. It was a final testament written on the eve of one of the most monumental and bloody battles in human history. The weight of that single date settled heavily in the room, changing everything. Dave knew he couldn't keep this to himself. He brought the letter to the Hendersons, who were just as captivated as he was. They read it together, their renovation project forgotten. The faded paper in their hands was no longer just a curiosity, it was a sacred trust. A young man had poured his entire heart into these pages, and his message had been silenced by a wall for 8 decades. They felt a collective responsibility to uncover the end of the story, to find out what happened to William and Eleanor, and to finally give their story the ending it was denied. To understand the letter, they first had to understand the world from which it came. 1944 was a year of profound anxiety and fragile hope. The entire globe was holding its breath. News from the front was slow and heavily censored for families back home. No news was a constant, low-grade torture, a state of limbo between hope and despair. For a young woman like Eleanor, a soldier's life would have been an agonizing cycle of waiting for the mailman, her heart leaping with every delivery and sinking with every empty-handed departure. The team, now a small trio of amateur detectives, started with the most obvious clue: the name Private William Parker on the return address. Their initial online searches brought up thousands of hits. It was a common name, and countless William Parkers had served in the war. They sifted through digitized military records and ancestry websites, hoping for a lucky break, a connection to Eleanor Wright or this specific town. It felt like searching for a single grain of sand on a vast beach, a task that seemed more and more hopeless with each passing hour. Their investigation then turned to the life Eleanor would have lived. They researched their town's local history, discovering it was a hub of wartime industry. Women had taken over the factories, running the machinery that built the weapons and vehicles for the war effort. They pictured Eleanor perhaps working long shifts, her hands busy but her mind a million miles away, constantly praying for William's safety. Her personal sacrifice, and that of millions of women like her, was a silent, unsung front in the war, fought not with guns, but with resilience and unwavering hope. The importance of mail during that time cannot be overstated. Letters were everything. They were tangible proof that a loved one was still alive, a physical connection to a world of normalcy and love. V-mail, or victory mail, was a system designed to save precious cargo space, where letters were photographed, sent as rolls of microfilm, and then reprinted at their destination. But William's letter was not V-mail. It was a full, personal letter, sent in a standard envelope, making its journey across the ocean even more perilous and its survival even more miraculous. Then, the central baffling question emerged, a mystery that seemed to defy all logic. Why was the letter found inside a wall? It hadn't been mailed there. It had been delivered. Did it fall through a crack in the floorboards from the apartment above? Was it used as insulation, a common practice in older homes? Or, a more romantic and heartbreaking theory began to form. Was it hidden? Did Eleanor, for some reason, place it there herself, sealing it away forever? The mystery of its location was as compelling as the contents of the letter itself. The Hendersons decided to leverage the power of their community. They took a high-quality photo of the envelope and the first few lines of the letter and posted it on the town's local history Facebook page. They explained where they found it and asked a simple question: does anyone remember Eleanor Wright or William Parker? They didn't expect much, maybe a few nostalgic comments. What they got instead was an explosion of interest. The story was shared dozens, then hundreds of times. The 80-year-old love story had struck a chord with the modern world. Their first lead came from the town clerk's office. They searched property records for the house, tracing its ownership back through the decades. They confirmed that a family named Wright did indeed live at the address from 1935 to 1952. This was it. This was Eleanor's home. They also cross-referenced local birth and marriage records, hoping to build a clearer picture of her life. The paper trail was old and faint, but for the first time, Eleanor Wright began to emerge from the shadows of history as a real person. Their search for William, however, hit a frustrating and misleading snag. An amateur genealogist from the Facebook group responded excitedly, claiming to have found a William Parker from their state who had died in combat in France in late June of 1944. For a day, a somber mood fell over the group. It seemed they had found their tragic ending. William had written his final letter, made his promise, and then perished in battle just weeks later. The letter was not just a love note, but a final heartbreaking farewell. But something didn't feel right to Dave. He contacted the genealogist and asked for the service number of the soldier she had found. He then spent an entire night meticulously comparing it to other records. The next morning, he had the answer. The soldier who had died was a different William Parker. It was a painful false start. A reminder that history is a messy, complicated puzzle. The disappointment was palpable, but it also renewed their determination. The fate of their William, Eleanor's William, was still unknown. The real breakthrough came from a place they least expected it. An elderly woman, who had been following the story online, sent a private message. Her name was Clara, and she was 91 years old. She wrote, "I don't remember an Eleanor Wright, but I remember the Wright house. My older sister used to be friends with the girl who lived there. I remember she was always waiting for letters from her sweetheart, a soldier. She used to talk about him all the time." This was it. A living memory, a direct link to the past. Clara's message sent a jolt of electricity through the small team. They were no longer just dealing with dusty records and digital archives. They were connecting with a human story, passed down through generations. They arranged a call with Clara, her voice frail, but her mind sharp as a tack. She confirmed that the girl's name was indeed Eleanor, and she recalled that Eleanor was a beautiful young woman with dark, curly hair who volunteered as a nurse's aide at the local hospital. Suddenly, Eleanor wasn't just a name on an envelope. She had hair, a job, a life. Fueled by this new information, the Hendersons dug into old high school yearbooks from the local library's archive, and there, in the graduating class of 1941, they found her, Eleanor Wright. Her picture was small and black and white, but her smile was radiant, full of the boundless optimism of youth. Looking at her face, it was impossible not to feel a deep sense of connection, a profound sadness for the girl who smiled for the camera. Completely unaware of the war and the heartache that lay just ahead of her, Clara, the elderly woman, provided more details about Eleanor's life. She remembered that Eleanor was deeply in love with William, a boy she had known since childhood. Theirs was a classic small-town romance, the kind that everyone assumed would end in marriage and a happy, simple life. He had enlisted shortly after the attack on Pearl Harbor. The entire town had held a farewell gathering for him and the other local boys who were heading off to war. Eleanor had been there, brave and smiling, but everyone could see the fear in her eyes. The investigation into Eleanor's life continued, and the team soon made a discovery that was both confusing and heartbreaking. Searching through marriage certificates at the county records office, they found one for Eleanor Wright, dated 1949. But the groom's name was not William Parker. It was a man named Joseph Kowalski. She had married, had children, and lived her entire life in a town just 2 counties over. She had passed away in 2010 at the age of 87. This new information cast a shadow over the romantic story. If she loved William so much, why did she marry another man just a few years after the war ended? The letter, hidden in the wall, suddenly seemed like a key to this poignant mystery. Had she given up hope? Did she believe he had died in the war? The absence of that one single letter, William's promise to return, may have been the very thing that rerouted the entire course of her life, leading her down a path she never would have chosen. Now, the need to find out what happened to William Parker became an obsession. If he had died in the war, Eleanor's decision to marry someone else would be understandable. But what if he had survived? The possibility of a different, more tragic misunderstanding began to haunt the team. They went back to the military archives, this time armed with more specific information about the time and place the letter was sent. They focused their search on the divisions known to be involved in the Normandy invasion. After weeks of painstaking research, a researcher from the National Archives who had taken an interest in their viral story sent them an email. The subject line was simply, "Private William Parker." They opened it with trembling hands. The official records were attached. William Parker had not been killed in action in June of 1944. His status was listed as MIA, missing in action for several months following the invasion. He had simply vanished in the fog of war. The records painted a harrowing picture. William's unit had been part of the brutal fighting in the hedgerows of Normandy, a campaign known for its vicious close-quarters combat. Thousands of soldiers on both sides were lost, wounded, or captured in the confusing and bloody maze of the French countryside. For months, William was little more than a ghost, a name on a list of the missing. For his family, and for Eleanor, those months would have been an eternity of silent, agonizing uncertainty. Then, scrolling further down the digitized file, they saw an update, dated January of 1945. His status had been changed. Private William Parker had been located. He was not dead. He had been wounded and captured during the fighting in France, and had spent the last 7 months as a prisoner of war in a German camp. A wave of shock and relief washed over the team. He had survived. He had made it through the war. He had kept his promise. The elation, however, was quickly replaced by a profound and heavy sadness. If William survived the war and came home, and Eleanor was waiting for him, why did they never reconnect? Why did she marry another man? The story had just become infinitely more tragic. It wasn't a simple tale of love lost to war. It was now a story of a catastrophic misunderstanding, of 2 lovers who had survived the worst the world could throw at them, only to be defeated by a cruel twist of fate and a letter lost inside a wall. The focus of the investigation swung back, once again, to the house itself. The why of the lost letter became the single most important question. Mr. Henderson, poring over Old Town records, found a building permit issued for the address in late June of 1944. It was for a minor electrical rewiring and plaster repair in the main hallway. The timeline was a perfect, heartbreaking fit. The letter would have arrived just as the work was being done. A plausible scenario began to crystallize in their minds. A moment of mundane, accidental tragedy. The mail is delivered. The letter, full of promises and dreams, is placed on a small entryway table. A worker, moving equipment, accidentally knocks it over, and it slips unseen into the gap between the wall lath and the floorboards. Hours later, the wall is sealed up with fresh plaster entombing the letter. A simple, careless moment, a tiny accident, had created a lifetime of consequences, silencing William's voice forever. The search for living relatives now took on a new urgency. They needed to find someone who could speak for Eleanor, who could fill in the emotional gaps in the story. They started with her husband Joseph's family tree, tracing it forward. After several calls, they found him. A man named Mark Kowalski, a retired history teacher living in Oregon. He was Eleanor's grandnephew. When they reached him by phone and explained the story of the letter, there was a long silence on the other end of the line. Mark's voice was thick with emotion when he finally spoke. He said, "My great-aunt Eleanor was one of the kindest people I ever knew, but there was always a sadness in her eyes. My grandmother told me once that Eleanor had lost her first love in the war, a boy named William. He had never known the full story, only the vague outlines of a youthful tragedy. He explained that Eleanor rarely spoke of the past, but she kept a small box of mementos from her youth, a box he now had in his possession. The box contained old photographs, concert ticket stubs, and a small leather-bound diary. Mark agreed to read through it, to see what secrets it held. A few days later he called back, his voice hushed with awe. "It's all in here," he said. She wrote about him constantly. The diary was the missing piece of the puzzle. It was Eleanor's side of the story, her own words finally giving voice to the silent heartbreak she had carried with her for more than 60 years. The diary entries from June of 1944 were filled with anxious hope. She wrote every day, praying for William's safety and eagerly awaiting his next letter. As the days turned into weeks with no word, her entries grew more frantic. "Still nothing from my darling William," she wrote in late July. "The waiting is unbearable. I pray to God he is safe, that he is just too busy to write. Please, just let him be safe." Her elegant handwriting became more rushed, more desperate with each passing day. In September of 1944, she received the official telegram from the War Department, the one every family dreaded. It informed her that Private William Parker was missing in action. The diary entry from that day is a single, tear-stained, almost illegible sentence. "My world has ended today." She described the feeling of her heart being physically torn from her chest. The world turning to gray, the future she had so vividly imagined with William dissolving into nothingness. Even after receiving the news, a small part of her clung to the hope that missing did not mean gone forever. But as months turned into a year, and the war in Europe ended, and soldiers began to come home, William did not appear. The silence was deafening. She wrote about seeing other girls reunited with their sweethearts at the train station, a spectacle of joy that felt like a knife in her heart. Slowly, painfully, she was forced to accept that her William was never coming back. Her diary reveals the immense pressure she felt to move on. Her parents, friends, everyone told her she was young, that she had to live her life. She met Joseph Kowalski, a kind and gentle veteran, in 1948. She wrote that he was a good man, that he made her feel safe. But she confessed to her diary that her heart still belonged to a ghost. Her decision to marry him was a choice for a future, any future, over a life spent dwelling in the ruins of the past. In a poignant entry from the 1960s, more than 20 years after the letter was written, Eleanor described seeing a man on the street in a nearby city who, from the back, looked just like William. She wrote about how her breath caught in her throat and her legs almost gave out from under her. It wasn't him, of course, but the moment revealed the truth. William was never truly gone. He lived on as a shadow, a question mark, a phantom limb of a love that had been tragically amputated by fate. The story of William and Eleanor proves that behind every old wall, there might be a story waiting to be told. Their love, silenced by chance, has finally found its voice 80 years later. What other stories are hidden around us? Share in the comments if your family has a tale of love or connection lost to time. If this journey moved you, please leave a like, subscribe for more incredible stories, and help us keep the memories of the past alive. With Eleanor's side of the story now illuminated by the faint, flickering light of her diary, the quest to uncover William's fate became an absolute necessity. The narrative was painfully incomplete, a conversation with one person hanging up the phone mid-sentence. The team delved back into the military records, tracing William's journey from the moment his status changed from missing to prisoner of war. They learned he had been held in Stalag 12A, a large camp in Germany, until it was liberated by American forces in the spring of 1945. He had survived the unimaginable. He was officially discharged and sent home in October of more than a year after he had written his hopeful letter to Eleanor. The records showed he was treated for malnutrition and a shrapnel wound to his leg, injuries that would leave him with a permanent limp. He returned not as the bright-eyed, optimistic boy who had left, but as a man haunted by the shadows of war, a man who had endured the worst of humanity, and was now expected to seamlessly return to a world that had kept on turning without him. The search for William's family line was more difficult, as his last known address was a childhood home that no longer existed. But by cross-referencing his military records with census data, they eventually found a possible match, a family with the Parker surname who had lived in a neighboring state since the 1950s. A few phone calls later, they found her, Sarah Parker, a retired nurse living in Arizona. She was William Parker's granddaughter. When they told her why they were calling, she was stunned into silence. Her quiet, gentle grandfather had never spoken of an Eleanor. Sarah explained that her grandfather William had passed away 15 years prior. She remembered him as a man of few words, especially about the war. He had a quiet strength but carried a palpable sadness that she never understood as a child. He met her grandmother in 1950, married her and raised a family, working for 30 years as a draftsman. He was a good husband and a loving father, but there was always a part of him that seemed distant, locked away in a place no one could reach. The story of the letter was like finding a key to a secret room in his soul. William's daughter, Sarah's aunt, was still alive and was able to fill in more of the story. She recalled her father trying to find a childhood friend after the war. He had written several letters to an old address, but they all came back stamped return to sender addressee unknown. He had even taken a bus trip back to his old state once, hoping to find her, but was told her family had moved away with no forwarding address. He had no way of knowing she was just a few hours' drive away, building a new life. The heartbreaking truth finally settled in. William had tried, he had come home, broken but hopeful, and he had searched for the woman he had promised to return to. But in a world without the internet or social media, a simple change of address was an insurmountable wall. He likely concluded that she had died, or worse, that she had simply forgotten him and moved on. The silence he received in response to his letters must have felt like a final, cruel rejection, confirming his deepest fears that the world he fought to return to no longer had a place for him. The team knew what they had to do next. They carefully arranged a video call, connecting Mark Kowalski, Eleanor's grandnephew, with Sarah Parker, William's granddaughter. It was a moment heavy with 80 years of unspoken history. When their faces appeared on the screen, there was an initial, hesitant silence. They were strangers, linked only by the ghostly echo of a love affair they had never known. But as they looked at each other, they saw not a stranger, but a reflection of a shared, inherited past. Mark spoke first, his voice gentle. He talked about his gratitude, Eleanor's quiet melancholy, the story of a lost love that had become a faint family legend. Sarah responded, her voice trembling slightly, describing her grandfather's limp, his nightmares, and the profound quietness that always surrounded him. It was as if they were assembling a puzzle, each holding a different set of pieces, and for the first time, they were seeing the full, tragic picture. They were no longer just descendants. They were the custodians of a story that demanded to be told. They spent the next hour sharing everything they knew. Sarah emailed Mark a photo of a young, handsome William in his army uniform, the very same man who had written the letter. Mark sent back the photo of Eleanor from her high school yearbook, her smile full of hope. Seeing their faces, young and in love and so full of promise, made the story devastatingly real. These weren't characters in the historical drama. They were two real people, whose happiness was stolen by a one-in-a-million accident. The most painful realization came when they compared timelines. William had returned home in late night. He had spent the better part of the next 2 years recovering and searching for Eleanor. She, believing him to be gone forever, did not meet her future husband until 1948. There had been a window, a period of almost 3 years, where they were both alive, both single, and both mourning a love they thought was lost. They were separated not by war, but by a simple, cruel twist of fate. The descendants decided they needed to hear the letter, to have the message finally delivered, even if it was 80 years late. They asked Dave, the man whose hammer had broken the silence of the past, if he would do the honor of reading it to them. On a quiet afternoon, another video call was arranged. Dave sat in his living room, the impossibly fragile letter held carefully in his hands, while on his screen, the faces of two families, united by this discovery, watched in silent anticipation. Dave cleared his throat, his voice steady, and he began to read, "My dearest Eleanor, ... The words, filled with so much love and longing, flowed into the quiet rooms hundreds of miles apart. He read of the dance, of the dreams of a white picket fence, of the solemn promise to return. The 80-year-old ink, faded on the page, became a living voice. For the first time, the letter was not just an artifact, it was a message being delivered. William's promise, silenced for so long, was finally being heard by the people who carried his and Eleanor's legacy. When Dave finished, a profound silence filled the virtual space. Mark was openly weeping, and Sarah had her hand over her mouth, her eyes filled with tears. They were crying not just for the sadness of the story, but for the beauty of the love it contained. They were mourning to people they had never met, but whose lives now felt intimately connected to their own. The letter had bridged the decades, delivering not just a message but a powerful, cathartic emotional release for generations to come. The story, now complete, was shared with the local news outlets that had first reported on it. This time, it was not just a local curiosity. With both sides of the tragic love story revealed, it became a national sensation, a poignant reminder of the personal costs of war and the enduring power of love. Soon, a curator from the State History Museum reached out. They had been following the story and wanted to know if the families would consider allowing the letter to be part of a permanent exhibit. The two families discussed the museum's offer. The letter felt so personal, a sacred text belonging to them. But they also recognized that the story was now bigger than them. It was a testament to the quiet sacrifices of an entire generation. It was a story of love, loss, and the cruel randomness of fate that could resonate with thousands. They unanimously agreed. William's letter deserved a final, honored resting place, where his love for Eleanor would be remembered forever. Before the letter was handed over, the descendants decided they had one last pilgrimage to make. They agreed to meet in person for the first time, in the small town where Eleanor and William's story had begun. Together, they walked the quiet streets, visiting the site of the old movie theater where they had their first date and the park where they had carved their initials into an ancient oak tree. They were walking in the footsteps of ghosts, making a past they had only imagined feel solid and real. Their final stop was the local cemetery. They stood before the simple, granite headstone of Eleanor Wright Kowalski. It was a peaceful spot, shaded by a large maple tree. Sarah, William's granddaughter, knelt and placed a small bouquet of flowers on the grave. Beside it, she laid a high-quality laminated copy of the letter, its words finally resting with the woman they were always meant for. It was a symbolic delivery, a closing of a circle 80 years in the making. They did the same at William's grave a week later, finally reuniting them in memory and spirit. The opening of the museum exhibit was a quiet, dignified affair. At the center of the display was the letter itself, perfectly preserved in a climate-controlled case. Beside it were the two photographs, William in his uniform, handsome and proud, Eleanor with her radiant, hopeful smile. The display told their story, the tale of a promise made, lost, and finally found. Standing together in front of the exhibit were the two families, no longer strangers, but bound by a shared history. And with them stood Dave, the plumber, a man who had gone to fix a pipe and had ended up mending the broken heart of history. He looked at the letter, a simple piece of paper that had passed through his own hands. It was incredible to think that this fragile object had survived a world war, the slow decay of time, and the brute force of a sledgehammer to deliver its message. It had revealed that our lives are built upon a foundation of countless other stories. Stories of love and loss that are hidden all around us, waiting in dusty attics, buried in old boxes, or sealed away behind plaster walls, waiting for the right person to come along and listen. The story of William and Eleanor reminds us that love can be more powerful than war and more enduring than time itself. Their promise, though unfulfilled in life, was ultimately kept. Its echo finally heard thanks to a chance discovery and the desire to uncover the truth. What stories are hidden in your family's past? Share them in the comments below. If their story touched your heart, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more journeys into the past that revealed the enduring strength of the human spirit.